On the 13th of August 1940, long before the United States would end up going to war, the US Army Armored Force submitted their characteristics for the medium tank M4, a design that was meant to replace the medium tank M3. But at that time, the M3 was still in its own design phase. No M3 tanks had left their factories. So why was the US Army so eager to replace their brand new vehicle? It makes sense when you add a little context. In early 1940, Nazi Germany had smashed through Europe, seizing Poland, Denmark, Norway, France, and the Low Countries by summer. Leading the charge was Germany's ultra-modern armoured spearhead, including hundreds of Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. Both these vehicles had a large turret that incorporated a single, relatively high-caliber gun, and, most importantly, contained 3 crew members, a commander, a loader, and a gunner. This was revolutionary for 1940, and allowed the Germans to operate their vehicles much more effectively than the Allies at the time, most of which were still using vehicles with cramped, one-man or two-man turrets, like these French Somme S-35s. The Americans were no different, with their most potent tank gun being the 37mm M5, mounted in the light tank M2 and the M2 medium. They realized they needed a new tank with at least a 75mm gun, housed in a single, rotating turret. This just was not possible in 1940. The new turret design was not ready, and would not be ready for a relatively long time. But what to do in the meantime? The solution was the M3. Make the best possible vehicle using the equipment they had at the time to bridge the gap until the M4 was completed. The 75mm gun was then mounted in a sponson on the hull of the tank, with a 37mm on top. As soon as the M3 design was finalized, the American engineers immediately started work on the M4. On the 18th of April 1941, the US Armored Force Board chose the T6 as the prototype vehicle that would, hopefully, eventually enter service as the M4. The Ordnance Committee were excited by the new design and recommended a wooden mock-up be built. This wooden model would hopefully be followed with a fully functional pilot vehicle. This photo, dated July 2, 1941, shows the hull of the prototype T6 under construction. The caption states that the hull is from an unspecified medium tank M3. The basic chassis, including the lower hull, engine, gearbox, final drive, suspension, and tracks, were all carried over to the T6 design. This would save huge amounts of time and money in the long term, as it meant that the factories had far less retooling and reorganizing to do once production switched from the M3 to the M4. Additionally, the M3 used a very similar lower chassis to its predecessor, the M2 Medium, which had been built originally to fit a standard railway car. The designers knew that the M4 would likely have to be shipped across the Atlantic or even further afield in the coming years, and so the chassis was kept. The basic chassis may have been carried over from previous designs, but the upper hull was new. It incorporated a much larger 69-inch turret ring and twin escape hatches, one on either side. These hatches were present on the M3 as well, and allowed the 5-man crew to easily bail out of the vehicle if needed. The driver and the co-driver sat in the front of the vehicle and shared one roof hatch on the left side of the hull, with a floor hatch behind the co-driver's seat. The turret of the T6 held the other 3 crew members. The gunner sat on the right of the gun, with the tank commander behind him and slightly above him to allow use of the Coppola. The loader was to the left of the gun. These 3 men also shared a single roof hatch, but obviously also had the option of the huge side escape doors. The turret front would be mostly removable, allowing the T6 to mount a variety of armament combinations, including 37mm guns, 75mm guns, 105mm howitzers, 50 caliber mounts, and even the British 6-pounder. The engine bay was designed to fit the Wright R975 engine, but extra space was incorporated into the design in case larger engines became available in the future. The R975 was a 9-cylinder radial aircraft engine, as the Army had not seen necessary to develop a brand new tank engine for the M4. The shape of the R975 required the Sherman to be almost a foot taller than if a standard L or V-shaped engine had been installed, and gave the tank its iconic silhouette. This pilot model, the first of nearly 50,000 vehicles, was completed on the 2nd of September 1941 and rolled out for presentation the following day. This early pilot is very clearly a Sherman, but contains many features that may look strange or out of place, as they never made it onto the production models we're all familiar with. Firstly, and perhaps most obviously, the 75mm gun M3 the turret and gun mount were designed for weren't ready, so they had to mount a shorter 75mm gun, the M2. You can see here the fake barrel extension the engineers had fitted onto the end of the gun to make it look like the longer barreled M3. The smaller gun was considerably lighter, so it threw off the balance of the weapon. This made the stabilizer essentially useless, and is why later photos of the T6 pilot feature counterweights on the end of the barrel, so that the gun and stabilizer could be properly tested. On the front right of the tank, you can see an armoured cylinder just beside the co-driver's viewport. This was a protective shield for an antenna mount. The T6 was designed as a command tank, and so the co-driver's position included a long-range SCR 506 radio. The antenna location wasn't ideal, and the long antenna could become entangled in the gun when the turret was rotated. In the end, production M4s were never really built as command tanks, so this wasn't an issue. Instead, command tank radios and antenna were retrofitted by the Signal Corps as required. The antenna mount would be replaced with ventilation in production vehicles. You may have noticed in this earlier photo this pair of 30 caliber machine guns. These were fixed in place beside the co-driver's rotor-mounted 30 caliber and were operated by the driver. The American designers at the time were still working towards their mantra of the more machine guns the better, as seen in their previous designs, and were seemingly very reluctant to remove these guns. They were finally eliminated from the design in early 1942, but some of the very first production Sherman still had them installed. The holes in the upper casting were welded over on some slightly later vehicles before being removed completely in the new casting. In this image, we can see the vehicle mounting the M3 Lee's Commander Coppola, including the 30 caliber machine gun that came with it. This Coppola only features on the vehicle on photos taken on presentation day, the 3rd of September. Later that day, it was decided to remove the Coppola and replace it with a split hatch, which became standard on production Sherman vehicles. This Coppola change was decided in a conference that also recommended the addition of a rotating periscope on top of the turret for the loader, as well as the elimination of the side escape hatches. The hatches were considered too great of a compromise of the armour integrity, as well as using up valuable space for ammunition. The conferees also recommended that a 50 caliber machine gun be added to the vehicle for anti-aircraft defense, and that a gun shield should be fitted to the front of the turret to protect the gun mount from enemy fire. This conference on the 3rd of September also confirmed that the T6 was fit for service, and would be standardized as the medium tank M4. The first Shermans rolled off their production lines in February 1942. The fate of the T6 prototype remains a mystery. Since the M4 had already entered production, the T6 was then used as a test bed for some of the early upgrades. This photograph from March 1942 shows the T6 mounting an experimental one-piece differential housing and machine gun dust cover fittings. The one-piece differential housing was phased into production over the next year, with the original three-piece design not being completely replaced until the end of 1943. The next two photos of the vehicle are from July 1942 and show the T6 on its side during a test of the newer steel tracks. The vehicle has a lot of changes visible in this photo, and more information can be found in the video description if you'd like to know more. It's interesting to note that the T6 is referred to in these photo captions as the M4 No. 1 Shop Pilot. This is the final known image of the T6, dated the 18th of February 1947. We can see that the differential housing has been replaced by a sloped armour field modification kit. This was designed in 1943 to give the vehicle extra frontal protection, but it never entered service. Some theorize that the T6 prototype was destroyed in a Korean War era scrap drive, or is perhaps sitting somewhere in the Aberdeen Proving Ground, rusting away. It would be a real shame for such an important piece of history to simply fade out of existence. The prototype of the most iconic tank ever designed, and the precursor to almost 50,000 war-winning vehicles. Maybe it'll show up one day.